Today we're doing a service on a 2000 Land Cruiser, the FZJ 105R, and it's got the A442F transmission in it. Owner's complaining there's a bit of a slip when it warms up, and also jumps in and out of gears occasionally and when it's in top gear. Transmission oil fluid levels correct, and also it's quite clean, so could have a leaking solenoid problem. Now I'm just doing a visual inspection for any oil leaks or anything like that. And a good idea to give the pan a bit of a clean around that pan rail and up here where it joins on the filler tube. And we'll just drain the oil out of here. You can see this pan's never been off, it's still Silasticed on there. You can see a little bit of the Silastic through the hole there, and that's the original stuff, the red stuff. The pan off, or get the Silastic unstuck, I've got this little blade that I just slowly work in there. And important to not bend the pan or gouge out the pan rail on the transmission, otherwise it won't seal properly. You might even, if you bend the pan, you'll need to get a new pan. Just sort of scratch along there, try and get rid of some of that Silastic, and you can actually put that in there and just give it a little bit of a love tap. And you might need to do that in a few places, wherever you can reach, and that'll just help free that pan up. And I think that's nearly got it. There we go. There we go. We can see the solenoids at the back there. And the filter. Probably hasn't been off in its 250 odd thousand Ks. The pan, you can see the Silastic all over it. And there should be a magnet in there. I'll pour a bit of that oil out first. You can see it's got 4 magnets, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they're just chock-a-block. All that stuff there, these magnets wouldn't be working anymore because they're covered in that fine metal. It reduces the magnetic field of the magnet. So the next place all that rubbish is going to go to are your solenoids. So that's the importance of actually removing the pan, not just draining the oil and doing an oil change, and also cleaning up the bottom of the pan and replacing the filter. Solenoids there. This one here on the left hand side of the transmission, that's your timing. The one next to that is your number 1 shift solenoid, number 2 shift solenoid, and then you got your lock-up, converter lock-up solenoid on the far right. I've just cleaned them a little bit. You can see how much muck's already come out of it. I haven't demagnetized yet. We've got the timing solenoid and the number 1 shift solenoid. These have a moulded coil, so the coils don't become contaminated. Maybe on the inside of the coil they can, but usually what happens on these is they leak. I'll just give them a flush, demagnetize, and then I'll give it a pressure test. Just make sure they're not leaking. Alright, I've cleaned them and hit them with the clean solvent, blown them all out. And now we're just going to pressure test them. And these have a little earth clip that goes onto the body. That's why they've got one wire. We test these at 8.5 volts. For some reason I like to do it at 8.5 volts. Car battery is usually pretty much dead at 10.5 volts. So you can test them at 10.5. You know that the electrical pressure at 12 volts is going to be a lot more at 12 volts than at 10.5 volts. But I somehow like to test them at 8.5, and if they're not leaking at that, then that's pretty good. So we're set on 8.5 volts, or close enough. I've got my little tester spun up on the lathe, and I've hooked up the wires there. I'm going to put about 65 psi air pressure into it, and then just check it for leaking. Starting on the timing solenoid, normally open. You can see that's not leaking at all now. And there's also a little bit more muck coming out of it now that we're pushing air through it. So the timing one, not a problem. Okay, I've got the number 1 shift solenoid. And that one's normally open as well. And that one's working well as well. So I'll just demagnetise these again and just give them another flush with the clean solvent, and that should be pretty good. These two can go back in. Another thing you can note, if these coils, if you have a look at that plastic, if it's discoloured in any way, sometimes you'll see a dark spot on it. It means it's overheated. Good idea to replace it if that happens, because it's on its way out. I'm not going to test the resistance in these because the transmission was operating pretty well. I couldn't get the fault. The owner's complaining that there's an intermittent problem there. Also forgot to mention, just check those O-rings, make sure the rubber's raised a little bit from that groove, and also that the rubber's nice and pliable. And these two solenoids, they share a common bolt there. We'll get that out. Wash trays nice and clean again, just to show you how much gunk comes out. I haven't demagnetized them yet. You can see it's already showing up on those magnets. I've got them underneath the wash tray there. And this will actually demagnetise your fingers too, look. Don't attract anything now. So now we can you can see there's a fair bit of rubbish coming out of it. That one's got a fair bit. Now I've got the clean solvent in my little bottle there. You actually need the liquid going through it air on its own won't clean it. You need the liquid to actually carry the gunk out of there. And again, ideally, you can uncrimp these and clean them up properly, but sometimes doing these particular solenoids, you can flush them out really well with the way I'm doing it now. There we go. I've got number 2 shift solenoid there. That one's normally open as well. And that one's not leaking as well. Just good idea, like I mentioned earlier, just check for any discoloration on the coil there. They're a moulded coil in that plastic. And ideally, if you had more of an intermittent problem with these, you'd be wise to just warm them up to about 70, 80, 90 degrees. Don't do it with a heat gun. You'll end up damaging that plastic. You've got to do it in something like an oven, or some way where you can control the heating up of it. We like to heat them up gradually, test them at about 40, 60, 80 or 90 degrees, and you just check the resistance in them. Sometimes they will be okay like this at room temperature, and then when you warm them up, you get a little breakage in there, go open circuit, usually at around 80 or 90 degrees Celsius. So that one looks pretty good. And this is the one that I believe has been playing up. This one is the lockup. I'll just put the wires on there. You can see that one's normally open as well. That one's working well as like the other ones. I believe that they were just contaminated. You saw how much rubbish was in the pan on the magnets, and you saw how much gunk I washed out of this. That fine metal would be stuck on the inside of this coil, and then it reduces the magnetic field of it. But at 8.5 volts, it's sealing beautifully. So at 12 volts or 14.3 volts, which is what a normal car runs at, that electrical pressure in that coil is going to be shutting that valve off a lot better. The shift number 2 solenoid goes on first, and you can see on that lockup there's a little bend in there, so you can't really put that underneath the other one anyway. And also check the O-ring. Okay, I'll just whiz the filter off now, replace that, put these plugs back on. You can't really mix them up. They're all sort of in their spot there. Clean the pan rail, just scrape off any elastic that's there. And we'll be putting a cork rubber gasket on that, cleaning up the pan. Got also another little plug up here. It's good idea to just make sure they, especially four-wheel drivers, they get a lot of water and muck sort of on there, so it's good to spray a little bit of WD-40 or CRC in there, in those electrical plugs. Just make sure there's a good connection there. When you get these filters out, it's always a good idea to just have a look in that pickup section there, because that's where any muck's going to accumulate. That's where the pump's sucking up through, and that's the top side of the filter there. This one's just got one pickup hole. Sometimes they have 2, 3, 4, and there's the bottom of it. You can have a crack at flushing these out because they're a stainless steel filter, but what happens, because they're shrouded, it's very difficult to get any muck that's in there out. So good idea to just replace it. Now these ones also have a pressure cable. You can see the cable just in there, and if you have a look at it, I can have a look, it's quite loose, so that can be tightened up a little bit. And like usual, I like to put these magnets up on the ridge there, not flat on the pan. That way the magnet can work underneath and on top. Just more surface area working. And we've got the cork rubber gasket. Cleaned off all the loose elastic there with the wire brush. One other thing, quite often you'll find that these bolts are a bit loose. So it's a good idea to just run through it all, just tighten it up a little bit. What happens, the gasket flattens out because they're a pretty big surface area on those valve bodies, and the gasket will flatten out and then these bolts will be loose. So it's a good idea to just tension them up. You may even improve the pressure in there because you've tightened it up, it's sealing better. The pan on, just make sure you put all the bolts in first before you tighten it up. It'll help stop misaligning the gasket. And also these little 10mm bolts, they're very easy to strip. Always double check your work. Make sure you tighten that drain plug as well. Going to have a quick look at the universal joints, the transfer case oils, good idea to check them, your rear diff, your front diff, and just under the body there while you're under here. Okay, I'm going to adjust the pressure cable, which is that one there, coming from the transmission, and it is a fair bit loose. So the first thing to do is to just check that the accelerator is getting its full travel. You can see the cable on top looks like it's a little bit loose as well. Now the tool I use, press the accelerator down, is just a bit of flat steel with a rod that goes through it, and that just locks on there as it pivots. So I can just push the accelerator all the way down to the floor and just sort of press that up against the seat there. And that accelerator's all the way down. And that's completely tight. So that's adjusted up properly. But the transmission one underneath there, where my finger is, you can see that can still go a fair way. And there's a little crimp, a little bit hard to get the angle because the whole car's got a lift kit on it. There's a little crimp there that's supposed to have it at the point where it's completely loose, and that was in the wrong spot anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tighten that up a little bit. It probably isn't even, there's only a little bit of thread there, but I'm just going to tighten it up, and that'll increase the pressure in the transmission. Now to tighten it, you want to make the outer cable go that way, so you're tightening the inner cable or lengthening it. So I've gone in about probably 3 turns. It's a little bit of trial and error. If you over tighten it, the pressure will be too high. It'll just probably be a bit harsh through the changes. So we'll start off with that and give it a test run. And I'm just going to start off putting I think 6.5 litres of transmission fluid come out, so we'll start off at that point there. But it's always wise to check the oil at operating temperature or as recommended at whatever temperature, and then just check it. Don't go by what come out of it. That should be just a guideline. And in these, the recommended oil is, the base recommendation is a Dextron 3 or your full synthetic. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put some Dextron 3. I believe it's a little bit thicker. So if you've got internal pressure leaks from a transmission that's done a few Ks, you want to put the thicker oil in there. The reason being is as oil warms up, it thins out, so the thicker oil escapes through any internal pressure leaks a little bit slower. And when I'm filling it, I like to put a hose down there. You just don't get an airlock there. You've probably found if you don't put a hose right down, you'll end up spilling a fair bit of oil. And we're just going to put 6.5 litres in to start with. Now, one thing to note, you can see the notches on the cold mark on the left here, on the dipstick. And you've got your low cold mark and your high cold mark. And on the right, you've got your hot, or at operating temperature, your hot low mark and your hot high mark. So you can see how far that actually expands. The oil expands with heat. So it's very important to not overfill these. But what happens, the oil will hit the spinning parts in the transmission and aerate the oil. And in a hydraulic system, air can be compressed, oil can't be. So you'll get spongy application of your clutches and bands, and you can actually burn out the transmission. So very important to have the oil level correct. So we're on the 6.5 litres I put in. Fairly cold day, it took quite a bit to pump the oil in. And now I'll take it for a test run, see how that pressure cable's operating, and we'll come back and check the oil level as well. Okay, back from a test run. The shift pattern's increased a little bit. At sort of medium throttle, it's going into gear a little bit later, not as sluggish. So just going to check the oil level now. If it's over full, we've got a vacuum pump where we suck a little bit out. If you overfill it, you may have to drain a bit out of the drain plug. And of course, if there's not enough oil, you need to top it up a little bit. To tighten the lock nuts if you've adjusted the pressure cable. Oil level's right. Hope that's helped. Thank you for watching.